A lot of the work that I'm going to show you today is just not my work, it's my colleagues' work in Moore Park, so I want to acknowledge them at the start. So, the challenge. So an industry overview, we are targeting 50% expansion in the dairy industry by 2020. We're going to increase stocking rates by from 1.8 to 2.5 cows per hectare in that time period. Our grass growth at the moment is about 9 tonne and we're targeting 12 to 16 tonne on average growth. The cost of producing a tonne of grass in Ireland at the moment is about €76 per tonne produced, and the approximate value of grass grown in Ireland is about 2 billion. The key to the system is to have dairy cows grazing high quality grass to achieve high levels of performance. So what type of swards do we require? We have to have swards that have a decent growth capacity. The target would be in or around, I'm not saying absolutely 18 tonne, but in or around 18 tonne. As we go on through this presentation, it'll become more apparent where this lies. They need to be able to grow seasonally. That means that we have to have grass in spring, we have to have grass in the middle of the season, and we have to have grass in the autumn when we want it. These swards have to have a high grazing capacity. We have to sustain, or be able to sustain about 11 grazings from the platform in a year. They have to be responsive to fertilizer. If they're not responsive to fertilizer, they're losing your money. And there's plenty of swards in the country at the moment that are losing farmers' money. They don't see it, but they're losing money. And they have to be persistent and grazeable. There's no point in having a sward that you have to keep cutting for round bale silage every time the cows are supposed to go into it. The swards that we put out there, they have to be able to be grazed, you have to be able to utilise the grass, it has to be processed into mill solids. That's the key of winning this game and winning the battle where we're going. Growing more grass, there's a number of questions we're going to ask you here now. What's the farm growing? How many people in the audience know what their farm is growing? If you want to know, good men, about 30%. What does it need to grow consistently? And the word here is consistently, not annually. Where is it not performing? Is it not performing in spring? Is it not performing by the 1st of August? Is it not giving you grass by the 1st of October? Where is it not performing? And why is it not performing? Is it because the grazing management is not good enough? Is it because the soil fertility is not good enough? Is it because there's not enough perennial ryegrass in the swards? So I suppose really where we have to start is we have to build up a picture of what the farm is growing, and we need to measure consistently. I'll just leave you here with this last line in red. A plan without a target is just an idea. And we all have plenty of ideas. We mightn't have the plan. So just, I suppose, to reiterate where we're going with this, this is just a seasonality of grass dry matter production as influenced by perennial ryegrass content. And what I'm looking at here, I suppose what I want to emphasize here is the low bar here. I'm colourblind, most Irish males are, but the low bar here, the red bar, is 15% perennial ryegrass swards, and the brown bar is 100% perennial ryegrass swards. And what I want you to focus on here is the grass grown here by middle of May, the May measurement, simulated grazing study done in Moore Park with Philip Cretan. There's 2 tonne of a difference between that sward and that sward by middle of May. So that's 2 tonne less grass for your cows by middle of May. So if there's 2 tonne less grass there, that feed has to be replaced by something else. And as we go across the season, a 15 to 100% difference in perennial ryegrass content in a sward is worth about 3 to 3.5 tonne of grass. So to put it in context, 100% perennial ryegrass sward can carry nearly an extra cow on the farm. So a lot of the game has been lost because we don't have perennial ryegrass swards that are responsive to nitrogen and that are responsive to your management. Perennial ryegrass swards, they have higher dry matter production, especially in spring. And like we will have, in Ireland, we'll have a lot of cows calving in February and March of this year. We need grass on farms, and we need grass to be growing subsequent to the first grazing. They are more nutrient efficient. Our work showed they're about 25% more nutrient efficient than old permanent pasture. They have a faster regrowth, and we have a higher carrying capacity. And the new work coming from Moore Park and from Clonakilty is showing that the additive effects of clover and perennial ryegrass swards is an additive increase in dry matter production of between 1 to 2 tonne. So this is pasture-based Ireland. It's in operation 2 years, started in January 2013. The 2013 growth rates are documented here. You can see it was a pretty difficult year to manage grass, and we had a fairly substantial drought in the middle of July. 2014 was a much better year, much more smoother growth curve, a better spring, some slight droughts in dry farms in early September. What I would see from my experience in grassland is, plenty of people have skills in grassland, but sometimes they lack the will to finish off the job. And that's synonymous of every, I suppose, job out there. People have plenty of skill, but they just lack will. And I think in grazing, you have to have the will to finish the job, and you have to have the will to do it right. That's just a number of figures at the moment. We put the map of Ireland on it, and you can get some context around what's happening. So we've been talking about 18 tonne of grass. There's a number of 18 tonnes of grass on that figure. They're achieving it in parts of Kerry. They're achieving it in Longford. And there's guys achieving 17 tonne in West Cork, 17 tonne in Tipperary, 16.5 tonne in Wexford. There's plenty of farmers out there measuring grass and getting very, very good production figures from grass. So it's just, before we had pasture-based Ireland, people would come to me and say, Moore Park, you could grow 16 tonne of grass. Well, believe you me, Moore Park isn't the highest producing farm in that figure. So there's plenty of farms out there who are applying good grazing management and getting their assets to sweat. And that's what I would say about land. If you're getting it to grow pasture, you're sweating that asset. So 2013, in pasture base, we break down grazing, we break down total dry matter production into grazing dry matter production and silage dry matter production. So in 2013, you can see here, on this axis here, we have the total dry matter production where those bars meet. 12 tonne of grass was grown. In 14, that increased to about 13.8 tonne of grass grown. And then when we look at the top farms, I just took the top 20 farms in both years, just to give you a bit more context of what's behind these figures. And if you're saying, the personnel changed, they actually didn't. The top 20 farms in 2013 were pretty much the same top 20 farms in 2014. So these guys were producing about 14 tonne in 2013, and that went up to about 16.4 tonne in 2014. So the incremental increase between the top 20 farms in both years was pretty much the same, 2 tonne here and about 1.8 tonne between the average of the farms. So you can see here, there's plenty of farms out there, and there is huge potential for Ireland to grow more grass. Huge potential. That potential is there. But we have to get, the mechanics of tapping that potential in place. So I'm going to show you another couple of slides here that I suppose is going to show us, how these guys are growing more grass. One of the key things that we have said, and a lot of farmers know it, spring grazing management is a key way of setting up the farm to grow pasture. And this is just a relationship between spring grazing dry matter yield, what the farm is growing by the 10th of April, and the grazing dry matter production total grazing dry matter production of the farm. And you can see here, spring grazing dry matter yield accounts for about 66% of total grazing dry matter yield. So it's the one key thing it's a key thing in driving total grazing dry matter performance on these farms. The other thing that's pushing performance on these farms and pushing grazing dry matter performance on farms is the number of grazings achieved on the grazing platform. And you can see here, as we increase, and this is the pasture-based data again, as we increase grazings on the grazing platform, grazing dry matter performance increases. And the relationship, again, is quite solid. So you can see here, two key things. And it's not a chicken and egg scenario because spring grazing management drives the farm to grow grass. And it drives the farmer then to have more rotations in the system. So there are really key, important things that you have to probably go home with from today. You have spring grazing management, it drives the farm to grow more grass, and it drives you then to have more grazings across the farm. So what are the high-producing farms doing? Why are they high-producing farms? They have high soil fertility. Soil index for P&K is 3, and it's decent pHs. I suppose they have the will to be good grazing managers. There's routine measurement going on, and there's proactive management. Proactive management, what I mean by that is they're coming in, they're taking out surplus bales when they need to, and they're coming in and they're supplementing when they are going into deficits. And they're proactive about that, they're not reactive. There's low variation in paddock dry matter performance from the best paddocks to the low paddocks. They're targeting spring grazing, and this is a crucial thing because last year, in a number of discussion groups that I was involved in, the target of 30% grazed wasn't achieved. But these boys are doing it. They're achieving it. All paddocks are contributing to the average of the farm, and there's more grazing being achieved from the farms. And reseeding is not the be-all and end-all of this. The highest producing paddocks aren't in many cases the newest paddocks. They're just being challenged the whole time to producing more grass by these grazing managers. And just 2 more slides here on this. This is just one farm, Tipperary. He's in the audience, so he knows his own curve. I won't ask him to stand up. But this farm produced 16.7 tonne. And what I want you to just focus on is the low variation here between the top paddock and the lower paddocks, and the smooth variation that you have. The next farm is a farm in West Cork. Again, this smooth variation that he has. And I could repeat that many, many times over for these type of farms. And many of you know these guys anyway inside in your discussion groups. We did some work a couple of years ago on reseeding methods and Philip Cretan's PhD. I'm just going to briefly touch on this. A lot of this is dealt in the paper. We had a control, which is a perennial ryegrass sward. This is spring reseeding in the second year production. What we found with spring reseeding, that spring reseeds produce as much grass as the sward that they were replacing. And looking at pasture base, some farmers are getting about 14 tonne out of spring reseeds, which is phenomenal. We'd expect about 10 to 11 tonne in the spring reseed. Generally, that would be an average figure, but I've seen pasture based farms up against 14 tonne, which is phenomenal. But what we saw where we compared direct drill, disking one pass on its own ploughing, and we had a treatment here where we diaquat and we used the direct drill. We didn't see significant differences in dry matter production across farms. I suppose I would preface this by saying that we had the seedbed that we had on these treatments was firm seedbed, not too fluffy. The seedbed preparation was very, very good. In autumn reseeding, again, we didn't see significant differences between reseeding methods. So for us, and from a research perspective, we didn't see too much of a difference or any real difference in reseeding methods if the soil seedbed was prepared well. But what I do see is problems at farm level, and generally we hear about the problems rather than the good stories. Like we see poor seedbed preparation, farmers reseeding too late, no rolling, and because of no rolling, a lot of plants being pulled out. When a cow goes into graze the sward, she's pulling out those loose plants. Moisture loss because there's no rolling. First grazing at a cover too high, or cutting for silage at the first grazing. Seeding with corn drills, where the spacings are too wide. Ryegrass won't tiller in those situations. Limited to no weed control, especially where reseeding has gone too late. And finally, use of old soil tests. Guys not using the cultivated soil tests. Old soil tests don't bear any distinction to what you've cultivated. And basically, if you're going to reseed, you have to use the soil test on the cultivated ground. But so there's some of the issues with reseeding, but there's also many, many success stories. I want to move on to innovations, I suppose, that we're going to move on in grass for the future. And this is one innovation that we have in Teagasc on the grassland side, which is the Pasture Profit Index. It's a total merit index developed to assist cultivar selection, to assist farmers in the industry in cultivar selection. It's built on the back of the DBI, the successful implementation of the EBI. In the index, we assign economic values to important traits. The economic traits are here: seasonal dry matter yield, quality, silage dry matter yield, and persistency. These are the traits that are basically measured in the Department of Ag recommended list. All the data feeding into the Pasture Profit Index comes from the Department of Ag recommended list. So basically what we do, we define the total economic merit of a cultivar in euros per hectare per year, and we rank the cultivars performance and total economic merit. I gave this talk at the 2011 Positive Farmers Conference, and you can go back into the proceedings there if you have them. So, we have worked with the industry for the last 3 years, and last November, we produced a test proof for the varieties on the recommended list with a PPI. So this is basically what we're calling a PPI, and that's the language we're probably going to use from now on. So I don't want to talk really specifically about varieties, but what I want to focus you on, I can't black it out at the moment because it's all up there. I want you to focus on the sub-indices. And the sub-indices are these traits of dry matter yield, soilage, quality, and persistency. Basically, the summation of the sub-indices make up the total value here. And you can see here that this variety is quite strong in seasonal yield, soilage, quality, and in persistency. Persistency is modelled from ground cover change across the year within the Department of Ag recommended list. So you can see here, we're now pushing ourselves into looking at the differences of the sub-traits of varieties. So if you were choosing a variety that was high in soilage, you might be looking at something like that variety, or that variety. You probably wouldn't be going to varieties that have, poor values in the same way that you don't go for for bulls that have poor values for certain traits in the EBI. What I would say is, in the proceedings and today, I'm only showing the test proof that we released in November. The second week of February, I think it will be, the PPI list will be published with the Department of Ag recommended list on the Department of Ag's recommended list from the Department of Ag's website, and that will be available then. I think all bar 3 varieties on 2015's recommended list will have a PPI value. So for us in the PPI now, our emphasis, I suppose what my stress to you is we're now placing that emphasis on key traits. We see large differences between varieties, and the differences derived from their agronomic performance. We've only started on this road. Well, we haven't started on this road. We're 10 years down this road, but I suppose now it's going public. But we are going to add more traits into the index, and we know from our cultivar evaluation trial that there is differences in grazing out score between varieties, and farmers are coming back to us with that. And there's also other traits that we want to add into this that we'll add in time. So what I'm just saying here, the PPI list will be published with the recommended list, and 95% of varieties available will have a PPI value next year, or this year, sorry. So this is pretty much the last 3 or 4 slides. Constructing grass mixtures, and as varieties are sold out to farmers, they are sold within grass mixtures. So constructing grass mixtures, what do you want from a sward? What are you demanding from a sward? You have to use a meaningful number of varieties. Putting in too many varieties dilutes the inherent individual characteristics of those varieties. Variety inclusion to me has to be trait driven. If it's not trait driven, what are we going after? Other things that we're going to have to account for inside in this are end use and soil type. And I suppose, one thing about mixtures is they can overcome some varietal individual weaknesses like disease resistance, which we saw a bit last year with crown rust, and quality. So this is just some work I want to show you briefly from Vincent Griffith's PhD, where we had monocultures here. 100% would be the monoculture sward, and then what we went across and we diluted these we mixed the swards into different combinations. So we had 3 cultivars. This won't be too controversial because some of these are now outclassed, so we'll have no seed merchant throwing eggs at me from the back. Abermagic, Toy-Star, and Green Gold. So you can see here, this is just a silage dry matter production. We did this for simulated grazing as well. Abermagic individually had about 16.4 tonne of grass grown. Toy-Star at about 14 tonne, and Green Gold was a kind of intermediate. So as we mixed it then between Abermagic and Toy-Star, you can see here that the performance of this mixture over 2 years started to decline. The Abermagic and Green Gold did pretty well as a 2-way mix at a 15% inclusion of Green Gold, but again, as we increased the Green Gold proportion, the performance of that mix declined slightly. And here, I suppose you could say with the inferior, or you could call this the outclass mix of Toy-Star and Green Gold, you can see here the performance of this mix also declined as well. The 3-way mix pretty much got to the advanced stage of the individual monoculture mix. So What is that telling us? And we'll summarize that in the next slide. The other thing as farmers you kind of see is what's the proportion change over time in that sward? Okay, when you get the bag of grass seed, that's what you get. If it's 100% perennial, if it's 100% one variety, that's what you get. But inside in this was a 85-15 combination of Abermagic Twi-Star. Within 3 months that had gone to 82-18, and a year on that was 85-15. So these are two diploids. They're two diploids, Abermagic and Twi-Star. The stability of their let's say emergence was pretty consistent with what their sowing rate was. However, when we started introducing a tetraploid, and that's what green gold is, to the diploid Abermagic and to the diploid Twi-Star, you can see here the evolution of these as sward proportions changed considerably. Changed so much so that the 15 and 30% went to nearly 50% of the sward. The 50% was pretty consistent at 60-40, and the same year this changed. There was a big change on this side. But what we saw here was a 15 and 30% inclusion went to about a 50% inclusion of that variety after about 11 months. So in mixture construction, the summary on this, from a dry matter production perspective and just dry matter production, we could nearly predict the performance of the mixtures from the performance of their monoculture components. We didn't get any real synergism. We didn't get any real interaction of one combining another where there was over-yielding taking place. And what I have to say, I probably do have to stress this to you. I haven't come across any variety that has every trait yet. In sward composition, we found that the diploid mixtures remained stable despite, and there was a slight difference in heading date within these mixtures. And what we saw was tetraploid cultivars were more aggressive, they demand more space, and they can take over more of the sward, and that's what happened inside in this scenario. So low inclusion went to a high sward proportion over time. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, for 2015, to grow more grass and to take on this challenge, what I'm saying to you is you need to challenge the farm. You need to establish a consistent dry matter production performance from the farm. I do think that we need to start focusing on increasing grazings across the farm. The average is too small. The average is about 6 1/4. That needs to increase. We do need to reduce the variation in dry matter production between the highest and lowest paddocks. On the higher producing farms, that variation is much lower than the lower producing farms. We need to replace the lower grass producing paddocks repeatedly. They just need to be replaced. And we need to increase the level of perennial ryegrass in the swards. And from a method, or a new method of identifying cultivars, that will be the Pasture Profit Index, where we will be using that for in variety selection. So I just want to acknowledge a number of key people here. The dairy levy. Somebody asked about the dairy levy research. Only for the dairy levy you wouldn't have the Pasture Profit Index. Grassland farmers and pasture base, this is now one of the major parts of our research program in Teagasc and the grassland side of things. We're getting more and more good data from farmers, and that's real data that everybody can relate to, and it's very important. Also, the Department of Agriculture funding a number of studies inside in this. So I'll leave you with one parting comment from our great friend Paddy O'Keefe. Paddy would say, the greater the challenge, the greater the response. There's a grass challenge out there, and we have to respond to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'll remain here as chairman, and before I continue, we've noticed there's a Mercedes outside 05D22102, and the lights are on. So please go out and turn off your lights. So we'll take questions, please, for Michael and for Stan. Michael, maybe I kick off by saying, are you casting a bit of doubt on grass mixtures? Are you saying there should be only 2 varieties in a mixture, or what are you saying? And maybe if you wanted to, or maybe you don't, is there a role for clover?
Yeah, look, it's not a perfect world we live in, and I suppose history is history, and we try to draw a line under history. But I think going forward, when we start mixing mixtures, you're trying to design mixtures that have key traits inside them. Our line on this is that, you don't put in mixtures, you don't put in varieties at less than 3 kilos in a mix. And we would be putting in between 12 and 14 kilos in a mix. So what we want to see when mixtures are designed, we want to see varieties in there at a decent level where you're getting decent performance. On the clover side of things, there is very good results coming from Clonakilty, from Moore Park. We're 2 years into that work. There's a couple more issues that need to be solved in that, but there's additive effects from putting clover into it, into swards. And what we don't want is farmers going out with one clover sward on one part of the farm and no clover on the other part of the farm. We know ourselves from curtains that does run into, we can run into blow problems with that. So we don't want that happening. So, Asgard, I think that pretty much answers that question.
Okay.
If you're putting in varieties, you put them in at a decent level to get the performance of that variety out of it.
And keep the numbers small.
Yes, and I think I don't want, we work with the merchants and the co-ops. They've been very responsive to this. You could go back into a mixture 10 years ago and there might have been 4, 5 and 6. There could be different reasons. There might not be agronomic reasons for that, but now that's gone down to 3 and 4. I don't think there's any co-op out there that has put in any more than 4 varieties in the mix, which I think is testament to their responsiveness to the message that's coming out.
Okay. Do you want to comment on that, Stan? Are you happy enough with the variety question, or?
I'll leave that to the expert.
Leave that to the expert. Okay. Okay. Can we take some questions, please? First, there's one back. There's one there. Tom, straight down, and then there's one on the left back there. Michael, is it? Is Michael? Yeah.
Hello. Hello. Case Fredericks from Bono, Wexford. Just a quick question. There was a lot of figures in the soil fertility, and I'd have to read them to take them all in. But I didn't see any mention of air and soil structure. Are all these figures based on that you have the ideal structure and aeration present? And if yes, what impact does it have if you don't?
Yeah, you're right. It's not an area I've done any major research on myself, and certainly fundamentally within the talk about soil structure and the importance of soil structure in terms of allowing roots to penetrate through the soil, in terms of drainage and all that, are equally important. I suppose what I was leaning on in terms of the research that I cited there was, looking at a lot of trials where all other things being equal, you look at the impact of fertilizer. And I guess from the point of view of some of the cost benefits I showed in terms of yield potential and stuff like that, that's what we see as being the potential that's in the ground in terms of the optimization of fertility. But obviously fertility is only the fertility component of everything else soil needs to do in terms of anchorage of roots. I mean, Michael even alluded to it, just purely the rolling at reseeding and the importance of that, even in terms of root anchorage and plant sustainability in the field. You have obviously getting drainage water away. I mean, one of the biggest single factors we see in terms of nitrogen efficiency across different soils is the soil water regime. And if you have a soil that's heavy land, very wet land, that's more waterlogged, you get much more denitrification, much more nitrogen loss to the air, and it's one of the single biggest factors that can determine the potential to which nitrogen is either lost out of the soil or retained in the soil and made plant available. So I guess the difference between subjective soil structure is a very subjective topic, and I suppose I didn't go there in the presentation because I just wouldn't have had the same hard data in terms of yield responses for different types of structures or different things you could do with soil to improve the soil structure. But no doubt it is certainly essential. And I mean, when we talk about filling that fertilizer gap, what you're trying to do is make sure ultimately the plant has enough nutrients, water from the soil to take it up to achieve its growth potential. And structure is definitely a very important criteria in doing that. Now, structure as well, I mean, you take some of the liming benefits, for example. Part of the liming benefits are also linked to things like soil structure. When you're promoting biological activity, you're promoting things like the earthworms and things like that in the soil, which obviously have a big impact on drainage and soil structure and nutrient turnover. But also even in terms of the microbiology and the things you don't see in the soil but are still working away from you and that are active and are growing all the time. The pH, those have an impact on structure as well in terms of the various metabolism that they have and the products they're producing and the effects of those in terms of organic cements and structure and stuff like that. So it's a little bit more subjective. That's why I didn't go there in the presentation, but yes, certainly very, very important.
Okay, thanks. Michael Kyle.
Michael Kyle, Scotland, and I'm very happy to report the grass is still green in Scotland this morning. But a question with regard to pH. pH tends to go up and down, large swings over a 3 to 4 year period. Is it better to apply the lime, on an annual basis, more as a maintenance rather than trying to correct it every 3 to 4 years?
Yeah, one of the things that would be sort of cause concern about pH is there is an issue as well. I've talked a lot about the importance of getting enough lime in. You can over lime as well, of course. And where you take pH too far, you do have an issue with things like, locking up some trace elements, for example, that over liming can be a problem. So I suppose given from where maybe a lot of farmers are coming from, where maybe lime is suboptimal as a rule, over a long period, I think any improvement in terms of lime application is a benefit, and you're going to see yield benefits, you're going to see swards persistency benefits, you're going to see nutrient availability benefits from improving the lime program at all. I guess the question arises when you're in that top 95% and you're trying to go the last 3-4% in terms of the real potential, then there might be an argument for pushing back to a more little and often application. But I'd say certainly, there are products available for doing that as well, some of the granulated limes or whatever, but I would certainly be of a view that, where you have a distance to travel in terms of soil pH, get that lime in early, let that start to work. And when you're looking for that last 4 or 5%, that's where a more little and often approach will come in. But I'd say if every farmer in the country had a good liming program, using lime on a 45-year cycle in line with a 4 to 5 year soil sampling program, every farmer in the country will be better off than just ignoring the problem altogether. But that last 5% certainly.
The only thing I see on farms is, on some farms, is there's a lot of annual meadowgrass coming in a short period, and annual meadowgrass does thrive when in low pH. So it probably is something that we probably don't lime until we get soil samples. There isn't that many farmers I know out there having a routine liming program, so it's probably something that we probably need to put in place.
Talk away, Andrew. I think you're okay.
Yeah, it's on. Andrew Gow again. Stan, you very briefly, you didn't mention anything about trace element inclusion in fertilizers. Now, sometimes I might be skeptical about it, but for example, I have seen low selenium in our forage that's in the grass or silage. What's your opinion on trace element inclusion in fertilizer, for example, the selenium?
The story with trace elements, I suppose, yes, the challenge with trace elements is some elements, and selenium is a good example, are required by the animal but not required by grass. Okay, so the selenium doesn't have a role in plant nutrition, but obviously it's very important for the cow. And yes, where you put trace elements on a fertilizer like that, it can follow through with passive uptake into the grass and increase the levels in the grass itself. So there's nothing wrong with that as a strategy. The one thing I would just consider, if you're planning an overall trace element strategy on the farm where it's geared more at the cow rather than the actual sward production, just remember that direct intervention into the cow with a mineral supplement, you're sure the cow is getting it. Whereas when it's in a fertilizer, you are introducing another potential inefficiency in the system with getting what you buy onto the farm as a trace element into the cow itself, in that the soil availability in the soil after application, the uptake by the plant and the availability when the grass is eaten to the cow, there's a potential inefficiency introduced there. So yes, as a strategy to do it, it is possible to achieve things like selenium uptake with a selenium fortified fertilizer, but just consider the other options available, such as rec supplementation. It depends on the system, it depends on the level of concentrate input you're using and what lends itself. But it's not the only show in town, but it can be effective.
Tom, down there.
Thank you. Phil Cooper from Dorset in England. We've got a lot of clients around us that have got soils that are naturally alkaline of sort of 7+. We've talked about putting lime on a lot, but what about for farms that are in those situations? What can they do to bring their pH back in line? Because obviously if pH is over a 7, there's still a problem with lockup of different nutrients.
Yeah, that's particularly the calcareous soils in England are a very different scenario to most of the soils we deal with in Ireland. We have a small proportion of soils that would be calcareous, but very few. I suppose really, okay, lime is off the agenda. The pH issues in terms of, in actual fact, in the case of phosphorus, it's the other direction because you can get fixation by very high pH with phosphorus as well as by very low pH. There's not really a whole lot you can do. I mean, the issue is that the soils are made from parent materials, the rocks, in other words, that the soil is originally made from, are just very high in calcium carbonate, and therefore will always naturally be high in calcium as a result. Some of their fertilizer choice may have an impact there as well. I mean, there are, for example, fertilizers such as ammonium sulfate as an end source, which is a much more acidifying fertilizer than products like CAN or urea, would be an option there, maybe where you want to pull back the pH, around the root zone to try and reduce the lockup of things like trace elements. The other thing I would say in terms of those calcareous soils where the pH is very high, and I'm sure you know it already, that the use of urea would be not advised in those situations, because high pH soils and urea tend not to mix very well, because the high pH can reduce urea efficiency. Not an issue for urea at the soil pHs we're dealing with in Ireland, but in those high calcareous soils in the UK it can be an issue.
Thanks, Tim.
Kevin Commons, farmer in Westmeath. Two questions. The first one, Stan, you mentioned sulphur, and my question is the sulphur, your sulphur recommendations, are they area or site specific, or are your recommendations for all the country? And the second one is, in a situation where we're changing land use, bringing it from tillage into grass, how do we get it into full production as soon as possible?
There are certainly 1.5 of them are for me. Sulphur. Is the advice soil specific? Is it site specific or across the board? No, it is site specific. A lot of the work that the current advice is based on sulphur is old work going back 70s and 80s, but I'd still stand over in terms of it was based on good research. At that time, the conclusion from work of 150 sites around the country was that about 30% of the soils in Ireland would be responsive to sulphur. If anything, in the meantime, I'd say that area should have increased, because one of the inputs of fertilizer that any sward in the country is receiving is sulphur that's coming out of the air in atmospheric deposition that is more or less sourced from emissions from industry. Now, over the last 20, 30 years, industrial emissions because of air pollution requirements have decreased. So if anything, the deposition of sulphur from the air is declining. Therefore, the area that potentially is responsive to sulphur is probably increasing. We don't, unfortunately, have a soil test for sulphur. That's one thing that scientists yet have failed to develop. But all the indications suggest that lighter soils with lower organic matter are the ones that are most vulnerable. So if you're on free draining ground where sulphur is more likely to leach, and where leaching is a bigger issue, you're likely to see a bigger response to sulphur than in heavier ground. But having said that, that doesn't mean to say some response to sulphur in heavier ground isn't possible either. That leads on to the second question, which was tillage and returning to grass, and it's linked basically to the same thing. When you return ground from tillage to grass, basically the organic matter in tillage soil is invariably lower than it would have been if that soil had been under a grass system, particularly under a grazing system. And what that means is that the sulphur potentially deliverable by the soil from organic matter turnover is less when the ground is coming back from tillage. And the same is true for nitrogen, by the way. You'll have less capacity to deliver nitrogen in that situation as well, because of the fact that the soil just doesn't have the same horsepower in terms of organic matter. So always beware, definitely for sulphur, for a farm that's coming out of tillage back into grass, but also even in terms of the nitrogen program, be aware that the potential mineralization of nitrogen in a soil that has been in tillage for a long time will likely be lower than if it had been in grass.
Michael?
Yeah, like I'd say, Kevin, if you're coming from a tillage scenario into grass, you have to build organic matter as fast as you can. Like the greenfield scenario in Kilkenny would say that, we started at very low organic matter in that soil, and it's only beginning to build now, which is about 5 years on. And many times we walked that farm and it probably would have responded to a lot more nitrogen, but it just didn't have it in the organic matter. So, and I suppose we had some experience of that when Michael Bateman's farm in Crookstown as well, where there was low organic matter built up from tillage. So to me, it's about building up organic matter as fast as you can, by any means that you can in those scenarios. Yeah, slurry farm.
Mike?
Chairman, 3 quick ones. 2 for Stan, 1 for Mick. First of all, soil testing, time your soil testing. Is it essential to be very consistent on the timing of when you take soil samples? 2 will say, using clover as well as just ryegrass. Are there specific things, we'll say, particularly some of the micronutrients that it might be limiting with clover where they wouldn't be with grass? And the third one for Mick, would you just treat, Mick, who said that planted your grass, we'll say that. Specifically how you might differentiate the management, we'll say, for perhaps the first 12 or 18 months with a new sward as distinct from an established sward.
The soil testing and the timing, I'd say yes, from the point of view of comparing soil tests over time, because one of the benefits of soil testing obviously is to get a point in time reference point for where your fertility at. But over a series of time, soil testing is also very important, that you're monitoring change in soil fertility relative to what your program is. Because obviously advice is always general and based on the average, and your own farm, it's useful to see and tweak your program specific to your own situation. So for that point of view, across the board generally, there shouldn't be huge variation depending on the time of the soil sample, but for consistency, I'd always recommend that if you're in the habit of soil sampling at a particular time of the year, to try and be consistent in the timing that you do it. Whether you pick the spring to do that or you pick the autumn to do that doesn't really matter, but be consistent. In terms of clover and ryegrass and the requirements, there's probably less work done on clover-specific swards in terms of P and K requirements than there would be on a ryegrass sward, but intuitively, a lot of the information would indicate that, particularly the P fertility status, it would be important that the P fertility status particularly is optimized for clover, where you might get away with a little bit of slippage on ryegrass. Certainly clover will probably be hit more by a slip in P fertility than ryegrass would. And in terms of micronutrients, off the top of my head, I don't know of any major difference in terms of micronutrient requirements with clover, the only exception being that molybdenum often comes up as an issue with lime. In order to avoid overliming, because it can cause a molybdenum problem which can induce a copper deficiency. One thing about clover compared to ryegrass is one of the species of grass that tends not to accumulate molybdenum very highly. And oftentimes we see a molybdenum problem will be more acute on an old permanent pasture with more wheatgrasses than a pasture of pure ryegrass. But clover is the exception in that, and the reason for that is that molybdenum is the element that the bacteria in clover use in the enzyme that fixes the nitrogen. And as a consequence of that, molybdenum levels in clover can actually be quite elevated, which can, so if your farm is kind of borderline for potentially giving you a problem with molybdenum and copper, just be more aware of that if you're aiming for a clover system as opposed to a ryegrass system. So that would be one just that springs to mind that I would be a little bit wary of. But where molybdenum is not an issue, I'd say no problem, drive on with lime, P and K for both and you'll be.
Thanks, Dan. Mike?
You probably think that we arranged that Mike Murphy would ask me that question. That's not the case. I pulled this out of a talk because I didn't have enough time to cover it. So what we would see, one of the key problems for us with reseeds is that pre-emergence guys don't spray in time to kill seedling dock. There's only one really time to kill the dock, and I think that in reseeds is that pre-emergence just before you graze it. That's when he's at a seed level, and that's when you can kill him and you can wipe him out. And that that is where the opportunity should be taken to make a reseed weed free. And the same for chickweed. You can graze out chickweed, but in some instances you have to spray it out as well. So for us, reseeds in many cases are grazed at too high a cover. We would say that you probably should be going into a reseed grazed at about 600 to 800 kilos, 600 to 800 kilos of dry matter, and come back in quite frequently then, just to tiller out the plants. That's a very important thing for us, because when you're making a reseed, when you're establishing it, you're basically establishing. Basically, what you're establishing is you're establishing a new sward that's probably 4,500 to 6,500 tillers. The previous sward that you're taking out was probably 1,500 tillers, and what you want to do is you want to create as many tillers as you possibly can. What we see then is some reseeds going for silage, and that's a pretty no-no, because you have canopy closure at that level and you're losing tillers in a new sward. There's only one thing that'll happen then, it'll open up. And the key thing for us is more tillers that you establish with, you have a greater chance of keeping all those tillers. In second grazing, in the first year of reseed, we probably wouldn't graze it above 1,400 kilos of dry matter for the year. Keep coming in, keep grazing it, keep it productive. Some of the issues, I suppose, that we see: too high a cover developing, grazing in wet conditions. You can't go into reseed in wet conditions and graze it and without doing damage to the sward. And the other thing I see is with some reseeds is getting too much slurry, getting dosed with slurry. We've done it ourselves. I'm speaking from our own problems, our own management problems in Moore Park. We did it a couple of years, 2 years ago, and we pretty much destroyed the reseed because it came back in annual meadow grass because it got too much slurry. So for me, it's with a reseed, a new reseed, it's about getting in there frequently, getting it grazed out, and getting it coming back as effectively as possible.
Thanks, Michael, and don't smother it with slurry. I'm afraid, a question, I know there's one question of that, we've run out of time, perhaps you could take it up with Stan or Mike during the lunch break. Listen, on your behalf, I'd like to thank Stan and Michael for 2 great presentations. And before we go for lunch, Tom O'Keefe now is going to give us the details of where we get lunch and how we're going to graze it, etc., etc.
The people that are in the breakout room with the red lanyards, they can get up now and come out of the room and turn to their right, and they will proceed across the reception area into the restaurant. The people with the green tickets, we'll just give them the red people a few seconds. Yeah, okay. The people with the green lunch tickets, when you leave this hall here, you'll be turning right when you proceed through the 2 glass doors, and you'll be going down that laneway there. So the green tickets now can commence leaving the hall. The green lunch tickets. That's a yellow, I'd say.